Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet. Sadly, 1 year after the World Health Organization announced that we were in a global pandemic, we are very much still in that global pandemic. The world has passed miraculously through the first year, terrible losses, but extraordinary work that spun out actually well before the World Health Organization announcement back in January, because of advances in biotechnology, sequencing and vaccines were being developed from January forward, such that we now have a suite of vaccines, tens of millions of people in developed countries vaccinated already, including me on Tuesday, my first dose of the Pfizer vaccine. But extraordinary questions, and the urgency is ramping up because of the variants to this COVID virus, the coronavirus, that have been emerging and are posing new threats, getting new intensity around the question of how do we get everyone safe. This is the Sustain What broadcast of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. I'm Andy Revkin, longtime journalist focused on global risk, mostly at the New York Times. And I'm very pleased today to present a special session of this Sustain What show around the questions of trade and vaccines, and where there are knobs to tweak that might navigate us between national interests, which are very much on getting people vaccinated in real time in countries, and the geopolitics, which is a reality. Countries are like China and Russia have been quick to dive into relationships with vaccine flows that suit geopolitics, and the idea that the people need a vaccine too. There's a hashtag on Twitter, People's Vaccine, that is pressing for true equity. And today's presentation involves some leading experts from relevant fields. I'll introduce them to you now. Hold on one second. Sonia Reed-Smith is with the Third World Network. She'll explain a little bit about her background and how she came to be focused on these issues. Third World Network has been part of this, pressing the case for equity in the face of economic imperatives that often seem to go in the other directions. Mikhail Ruta is at the World Bank Group. He has a new working paper out with some colleagues that we'll explore. Gabriella Marceau is a senior counselor in the research section of the World Trade Organization. We're going to learn about a little bit of the context of the trade history and how it relates to vaccine equity and getting out of a pandemic. And a colleague here at Columbia, Tedros Mavroitis, who's a professor at the Columbia Law School and associated with the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, which is really conceived of this show today. It's great to have you all here, and I hope you're all doing okay. You know, it's such a strange time these days. And I thought we'd start with Gabriella Marceau, just to sort of build a little bit of the background case. What was world trade history like until January of 2020? And then how has everything been changed and challenged now? That'd be a good way to start. And then we're going to build forward from there. So Gabrielle, good morning to you.
Good afternoon from Geneva.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy, for involving me in this panel today on such important issues and with great colleagues. We do get the question often, what's the link between WTO and trade and vaccine? Because vaccine people think of TRIPS. So I thought that first I was going to describe a bit generally the relevance of the WTO. And to the question you ask, Andy, I would even conclude in advance that the only way to avoid sort of moral failure is if trade, but good trade, and Sania, we may say equitable trade, is involved in the recipe. There is no way we can have, we can avoid such moral failure without trade. But why WTO? Well, because WTO, and it was true from before, has rules that are directly relevant not only to the vaccine, but also to the inputs to production of vaccines. So I'll mention simply a few of those rules, and you will see how relevant it is for COVID and for vaccines. So WTO has rules about tariff. It tells you that you should respect the maximum tariff that you want to collect, but it encourages you to reduce tariffs. So of course, it can become extremely relevant, and my colleagues will develop if you have, as a government, very high tariff against things that you would benefit from. There are rules on export restrictions. More will be discussed about export restriction, where generally export restrictions where a government refused to export vaccines or other medical goods or food during COVID. Generally, export restrictions are prohibited, but they're possible on emergency situation for essential goods for a very short period. There are rules on subsidies in the WTO, which will become very important when we talk maybe a bit later on about the production capacity that need to increase. We have rules on services, etc. So many relevant rules that can enhance access to medicine possibly, or even if it's poorly done, reduce. But the WTO, contrary to the GATT, has another fundamental goal that is new with the WTO, not with COVID, but becomes relevant. One of the goals of the WTO is to enhance sustainable development, which of course includes the health of everyone. Now, what happened to go back to with the pandemic, the WTO sort of got a new role, a little bit similar to the role that the G20 gave to the WTO during the financial crisis in 2008. That is a role of a transparency hub, where all governments, on the invitation of the WTO DG, started notifying their restrictions to food, to other products necessary, mask, ventilator, with a view to more transparency, with a view to helping everybody to hopefully coordinate and understand what is done and not done and what could be done. The one point that I'd like, and I'll finish with this for now, to mention that is a bit positive, and I'll further develop it, is that the pandemic, and it's fundamental for vaccine, led to an amazing amount of unique collaborations in international forum in Geneva, in the UN. We have seen often collaborations between IGOs, international organizations, or between countries. We've had some of them, but the new type of collaboration that we should discuss further are between private and public, not only for the production of all sorts of applications, even hospitals. When it started, I was told, for bed in hospitals, the head doctor would call the head doctor of the other hospital to find out how many beds left they had. And then companies together, contrary to competition rules, if you want, manage to put in place and invent new applications. So this is done for the benefit of everyone. But there's a lot of collaboration also with a private sector. So I just read this morning that in Africa, somebody was suggesting that for the distribution of vaccines so far to be received in a few weeks from COVAX, itself COVAX being a collaboration, they were considering association and links with DHL, that has an outstanding distribution network, or Coca-Cola, that has freezer. So I'll develop further, but I would only say that it's only if WTO rules are well used that we will be able to ensure an equitable distribution and production of vaccines. Thank you, Andy.
That's very helpful. This trade arena is something that's complicated to those of us who are not, dug in on that, but it's also very consequential. I'm showing here one of many tweets these days that is pressing the case for I guess some changes in things. I guess we'll have to talk about the TRIPS waiver at some point. But before we move forward, Gabrielle, is there a sense that emerged here that our trade norms are essentially not adaptive? Are they much more of an impediment or a lubricator of this kind of innovation you were talking about?
Well, I mean, some of the rules, and Michele and Tedros will talk about them, that prohibit export restrictions, for instance. You cannot prohibit sending vaccines abroad, are basically decent. The rules that encourage low tariff are good, but it depends how government use them and apply them and whether they respect them. You know, there's always a gap between the theory, the potential of rules, and how they are applied. But yes, I mean, the rules could be improved, for instance, and this is not only for vaccine or COVID, rules on subsidies. Many are saying, whether it's for climate change or vaccine, maybe we should think of new rules and subsidies allowing, for instance, and we'll talk about that, enhancing production and having the right for a while maybe to set aside some aspect of the subsidies rule that try to regulate this. But yes, I mean, rules can certainly be improved, but existing rules could be better used.
Okay. So I thought we'd go next to Sonia Reed-Smith. And actually, Gabrielle, where are you also in Geneva?
I'm in Geneva, yeah. I'm in my office at the WTO. Sonia is also, but I don't know where she is now.
Good. Well, Sonia, good afternoon to you. And what's your take on this? Just give a little description of Third World Network and when this issue erupted, and now with the vaccines here, what keeps you up at night and thinking about the path forward? Or maybe we're having a little bit of an internet lag there. Sonia, can you hear me?
Yes.
If you're okay, go for it.
So thank you very much for including me. Third World Network was started by a consumers organisation in Malaysia some decades ago to look at the implications of international trade rules like the World Trade Organization on developing countries and least developed countries. I'm based in our office in Geneva, so the same city as Gabriella Marceau. And so we've been looking at the implications of the WTO rules for access to COVID vaccines, medicines to treat COVID, N95 masks, ventilators, test kits and so on. And so I'm sure, as you've been following, there isn't enough supply of vaccines in the world, and most of that has been bought up by developed countries. So I think at this point, 10% of the US has been fully vaccinated, and President Biden expects to have enough.
You're cutting in and out a little bit. Let's
to vaccinate all adult Americans by the May this year.
I'm sorry, Sonia, you were cutting in and out there. Let's go to Tedros a little bit. Tedros, can you talk about some of the dynamics, the sort of clash of interests here? And
yeah, is that better? Can you hear me now?
Maybe that's a little better. Yeah, there's a lot of background noise, but let's see if we can hear you.
Yeah, so I was just saying that Bloomberg estimates that at the current rate of vaccination, it will take 5 years to vaccinate 75% of the world and get herd immunity. So because of this vaccine nationalism, where the developed countries have bought up a lot of the vaccines and are vaccinating, almost all their populations before even the healthcare workers in developing countries, as you can see on the slide, most of the vaccines have been going to developed countries. There was a study done by Northeastern University in the US, which found that 61% of the deaths could be averted if the vaccine was distributed to all countries. Proportional population.
I'm sorry, but again, you're cutting out. We might have to try to get back to you.
High-income countries vaccinate all their people first. Only 33% of partners.
Tedros, can I get you to weigh in here a little bit? I'm going to see if we can get a better connection with Sonia. So these issues seem to be these, I guess this is where law comes in too, clashing interests, clashing scales, clashing perspectives. Petros?
Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You see, in my view, this is a golden opportunity for the new US administration in a way, as much as it's a macabre subject, the COVID-19 and what happened since the beginning of the pandemic, because the Biden administration has clearly, there's a change of tune. They want to do something, they want to be proactive vis-a-vis the vaccines, and want to be proactive and take the necessary steps to combat the pandemic. And the Biden administration also wants to reinvest in reestablishing the international liberal order. And I think the COVID-19 story is the natural link between the two. And let me say 2 words about this. Now, what do we observe now? I mean, at the domestic level, there is this ongoing struggle in different ways, but the struggle is the same. Where do we see the trade-off between economy and health? How much economy at what cost? Nations have different approaches, came up with different solutions. There is diversity, that much is clear. But this is not a question for, to a large extent, for international perspective. Now, what we also observe, though, is the consequence of the fact that there's no international health policy, it's national policy. I mean, of course, you wouldn't expect the WTO, like no other trade agreement, to deal with distributional issues. This is rationally national policy. Now, what we observe is what a dear friend of mine, Tom Boyke, called the vaccine nationalism. Right. Quotas flourish, from embargoes to quotas, and worse, even discriminatory quotas. We send vaccines to friends, we don't send vaccines to foes, and so on and so forth. Now, the WTO especially paid a huge price of US absenteeism in the last years, because by disengaging from the WTO, all hell broke loose, everything went south. That's why I say, I mean, this is in a way, it's a golden opportunity for Biden to look into the situation at home, but also to come up with proposals to reunite the world against vaccine nationalism, to explain the obvious rational policy here, that if I'm healthy and my neighbor is not, I risk being sick once again in the future.
Yeah. But here's where it just, the domestic politics is so, here, I'm just going to show you. These are 2 tweets yesterday. Ashish Jha, who's a noted pandemic scientist, thousands of people are dying from COVID every day around the world. Large outbreaks elsewhere, breeding ground for new variants. And we are sitting on tens of millions of AstraZeneca vaccines at this point. I'm pretty sure we'll never use. Time to give them away. At the same time that the Republican congressman is introducing a bill saying we must vaccinate America first. And I know Biden has all kinds of ambitions for more of a liberalism approach to diplomacy, but the primacy of domestic politics makes it so tough. I don't know if does that still feel like an opportunity or a nightmare?
Yeah, well, I mean, should I go ahead or you want someone else? Yeah. You see, remember what I said before, there's nothing like an international health policy. Health policies are national. Right. So, and there is no obligation to impose export quotas. I mean, they chose to impose export quotas. Some did, many did not. This is where I see myself the role of the leader. I mean, if you go back in time and you look into the US that you and I love from the 40s, when they were reestablishing the international, or establishing for the first time a liberal order around the world, they did it at the cost for the US. But in the medium to long run, it was in the interest of the best and the brightest to have some sort of certainty regarding transaction costs, and that's the idea of the order. Now, by following these extremely narrow-minded policies, where quite frankly I was looking, for example, the European Union regulation concerning export quotas. I couldn't, with my co-author Henrik Horn, we couldn't understand what was the criterion. Do you want to help your free trade partners? No, because some you did, some you did not. You want to help developing countries? No, again, because some you did, some you did not. I mean, this should not become a politics game. There's a difference between policy and politics. If it becomes political, then it is dangerous. And this is a thing where the Biden administration can help by setting the tone straight. Let's have some criteria. How do we rank here the needs? Who should we go for first, irrespective of passport and so on and so forth?
Right. And again, the rational realities, we'll get into, Michela will come on in a second as an economist. I've seen several reports saying that without a global approach, there's trillions of dollars in lost global economic activity that will come back and hurt the United States and other individual countries. So the rational reality is there on these. Global public health is a thing that needs to be resolved, just like national public health, before you can restore an economy. I still worry as a journalist how that relates to the political realities on the ground. But Sonia, I want to see if you're back on with a better signal. Maybe we could get more input from you on that, the populist perspective here, the sort of the people's perspective.
I don't know if you can hear me better now. Thanks for that.
Sounds better, yes.
Okay, great. Because yes, as you were saying, this vaccine nationalism doesn't just hurt people in developing countries. The OECD was saying that the global economy this year will lose up to $9.2 trillion US, half of which will fall on developed countries because of vaccine nationalism, because even the developing countries cannot reopen their economies until their people are vaccinated. And the slow vaccinations also harm people in developed countries because, as the WHO and the President of the European Commission have said, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So because this virus mutates and some of these mutations can evade vaccines, then we'll need booster shots or we'll have to have vaccines with multiple strains, so then the fewer mutations that can develop. So that is another reason why vaccines need to be increased, their supply needs to increase so that we can actually vaccinate the whole of the world, not in 5 years' time, but sooner than that. So there's one of the reasons why there's a restriction and there's not enough supply of vaccines and other products needed to deal with COVID is intellectual property. As Doctors Without Borders noted that there are patents on COVID vaccines. Patents have been a barrier in the past to affordable vaccines, for example, the pneumococcal vaccine. The governor of Kentucky asked for the patents on the N95 masks to be released so that more masks could be made. There are patents on the monoclonal antibodies that are used to treat COVID-19. The Netherlands had a shortage of the chemicals used for COVID tests, and Roche would not release the secret recipe so that others could make more of these chemicals so that there would be enough COVID tests early on in the pandemic. So this was a trade secret issue. And you probably remember Italy in March last year ran out of ventilators and ventilator valves. So engineers were 3D printing them for $2 instead of the original price of $11,000. And they got hundreds of requests to 3D print these valves, but they didn't share their designs and their ability to do it because the manufacturer threatened patent infringement. And the industrial designs and copyright protection on ventilator valves could also prevent 3D printing of generic versions in pandemics like this. So this is why a number of countries, and we can talk about the TRIPS waiver in the next stage, have said that these intellectual property barriers are restricting the supply. This is not just harming developing countries, but also those in developed countries.
I see that on Twitter, Bernie Sanders was agreeing with your position. So there are some U.S. Voices who are calling for truly an open approach to vaccine development. And this takes us to Michela's paper, because you have done an analysis. Let me just show it here. But hold on, let me go back to group view. Sorry, I'm my own producer, so the technology, as we all know, we've lived with this for a year. It can be challenging. But Michela, if you could react a little bit to what you've heard so far and explain your role at World Bank Group and what you've been working on that might offer a bit of a pathway here.
Hi, and thank you very much for having me here, and great to be here with everyone. So I'll probably start taking a step back and just to discuss what has been the economic side. The most interesting aspect, in my view, has been the fact that really the policies during the pandemic have been upside down. When we think about trade policy, generally countries try to restrict imports or to promote exports. So this is what happens in normal times. And as we've been discussing both on vaccines more recently, but for medical goods such as masks earlier, the behavior of governments has been very different. And the reason is essentially scarcity. We had scarcity of masks back in March, April, scarcity of ventilators, and more recently we have scarcity of vaccine. All of this simply means that there is a gap between the global demand of these products and the global supply. So the policy implication is that we need to boost supplies. We need to do whatever it takes to increase the supply of the products that are scarce. Now, this is not how governments react, or not only how governments react. So producer governments, that are obviously the exporters, tend to impose export restrictions. They obviously do this for good reasons. They're trying to increase the domestic supply of the goods. The problem is that this increase in domestic supply is simply matched by a reduction of the supply in the foreign markets. So governments over the last year have taken all sorts of export restrictive measures, taxes, quotas, bans. They have imposed somehow arcane authorization mechanism, and they have done other sorts of marker things on this set of medical goods and more recently on the vaccine. So with the Global Trade Alert and the European Universal Institute, we at the World Bank have been monitoring these measures. Just to give you an idea, between the first 6 months of the pandemic, there have been 137 such actions imposed by many governments around the world. Now, the question is, what are the consequences of these measures? And I think there are essentially two sets of consequences, in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, the problem is that export restrictions and cooperative policies increase the gap between demand and supply in the global markets. And we have seen this because prices very often have been going up very rapidly. So for instance, for masks, if one compares the export prices in May, June 2020 with 1 year before, prices were 800% higher and 4 times higher than the increase in the export, in the quantity of exports. Second, and Sani and others have been talking about that, there are equity issues that come out. Very often the importers of these products are developing countries and least developed countries. And so that creates a problem of distributions that I talked about. This is in the short term, but I think it's also very important to understand the implications for the medium and the long term. One concern is that these type of measures not only do not increase the global supply of goods, but actually can harm it, because they create distortions and they may reduce incentives to invest in the production of these goods. And so they work in the opposite direction. Rather than increasing, they may decrease the incentive to produce more. Second, we need to remember that trade relies on trust. I need to trust that when I will need a medical good, I will be able to import it. If I don't trust the system, then I am more likely to resort to self-reliance. And this is obviously going to be highly inefficient in the longer term, because it doesn't abide to the principle of comparative advantage. So to make a longer story short, I think it's important to rethink the policies that we have been using and trying to push more towards collaborative actions.
Do you sense, I put on the screen an excerpt from your new working paper, and hope that people can find it at that link and read it later. Could this have been anticipated? There's so much of the pandemic risk that was anticipated. My friend and colleague Laurie Garrett wrote a book in 1996 about the coming plague. So the biomedical realities were there. But and this is for you and Gabriella and everyone else here. Could this vaccination logjam and ethical dispute have been anticipated? And if it wasn't, why are we scrambling? In other words, why are we scrambling now to come up with fixes? Maybe Mikhail, again, briefly, shouldn't this have been sort of something someone had looked out earlier? Or I don't know.
I fully agree with you that the problems that we are seeing right now on vaccines would have been somehow anticipated. So what we did in this paper was to look at the countries that produce the vaccines, and we went through medical records to identify the ingredients, and particularly the key ingredients that are needed for the production of the vaccines. And what we find is that this production is, both of the vaccines and the ingredients, is extremely concentrated. And it's getting more concentrated now that we are trying to scale up production. So in some sense, this could have been anticipated. However, let me say that I think the focus would not be that much on what we did wrong the past few months. I think it's important to concentrate on what we can do right in the future months.
Right. There's not much utility in blame games. But Sonia, from your point of view too on this, I assume, like so many equity questions, the balance is always, it seems like we always come late to the developing countries. The numbers here are still stark that the Director General WHO had pointed out back in January, where there were, I think, 25 doses had been administered in the poorest countries and tens of millions in rich countries. So in a way there too, it feels clear that this was almost an inevitability. But looking forward again, does this feel like a sensible approach here, and or how does this relate to what you were describing earlier in terms of patents and the like?
Yeah, thanks for that. This is actually, as you say, not a new problem. I think it was the H1N1 pandemic where we had the same issue in the past that the developed countries brought up the supply of the come to a better solution by now. And this is why many countries, including all of Africa and all of these developed countries in the WTO, supported by more than 100 countries, are proposing to temporarily waive the intellectual property protection, certain intellectual property protections like patents, trade secrets, industrial design, and copyright on products to prevent, contain, or treat COVID, like vaccines, medicines, N95 masks, and ventilators, and so on. And this TRIPS waiver, it's called, is because TRIPS is the name of the intellectual property rules of the World Trade Organization, has been supported by the World Health Organization's Director General repeatedly, UNAIDS, relevant UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights, the Vatican, I think about 30 US congressional representatives, including, as you said, Senator Sanders and Nancy Pelosi, more than 100 members of the European Parliament, British MPs, the whole Chilean House of Representatives, International Trade Union Confederation, a petition signed by almost 1 million people, and so on. And yet it's still being opposed by developed countries at the WTO, like the US, the European Union, the UK, Japan, Canada, Switzerland, and Norway. And this is being discussed now for a number of months in the WTO while the pandemic is going on, while people in developed countries are getting vaccinated, but people in Africa and other developing and least developed countries are still waiting for vaccines. So this wisdom that we're enforcing used for the intellectual property rules in the WTO in the past. So this is a flexibility that is built into the WTO rules that more than 100 countries are asking for, and yet which has been blocked at the WTO by the developed countries that I mentioned. So there is a possible way to deal with this, or at least to reduce some of the barriers to increasing production, to deal with this inequitable distribution of vaccines and even test kits, which are still there are shortages of in developing countries, N95 masks, medicines like monoclonal antibodies and so on. But this possible solution is being blocked at the WTO.
Gabrielle, over to you on the other side of Geneva.
Yeah, I think we may be on the same side of Geneva. So 2 or 3 points. Your initial question, whether the pandemic could have been avoided, I think that some of the UN agencies have been saying that for years, that it was going to come.
Just to be clear, I wasn't talking about the pandemic itself. I meant that was clear. There was lots to be done there in terms of public health preparedness, but I'm talking about the trade and economic battles.
Well, they're directly, in my view, they're directly linked. I think, could we have avoided or created a vaccine earlier? Well, no, because it's been done in a record time. But clearly, the COVID is caused by the way we live. And if we had avoided the problem at the root, the solution that is patching would not have been needed. But I wanted to say 3 things. I think it was well explained by Michele that the problem originally with masks and ventilators was scarcity. So there's a problem that a lot of things that we needed, including vaccine, had to be produced. There's a problem of allocation, who gets them, and distribution, like in Africa, warmer areas, with those vaccines that need to be sort of frozen. So if we look at these problems, maybe how to better deal with existing vaccine. I was reading this morning that Africa is receiving from COVAX, as you know, COVAX, this vaccine created by WHO with hundreds and other participants. This, we should deal with that in the short term. And this is where I find collaboration from the private sector. I mentioned DHL and Coca-Cola is amazing and a necessity. But the biggest problem, and I think it's been mentioned also by Senia, and I'll talk about the TRIPS waiver, the biggest problem is even if there was a TRIPS waiver agreed today, we have a capacity to produce about, I think it's 3 trillion doses, and we need 10. So it's a production problem at the moment. And even if we want to improve intellectual property rules, and even if, you know, as I said, it was accepted, what we need to focus on, as mentioned also by our new DG, the first week she was here, she met with the pharma companies and she said, yes, let's talk about the TRIPS waiver, but what we need to do is produce more and more and more, and in developing countries. And there, possibly the TRIPS waiver would deal with that, but I think it's more a private-public sort of challenge that is new and that will require new partnership. And one question that I have for everyone, we all know, everybody repeats, until everybody's safe, nobody's safe. Nonetheless, we still have those proportions. 10% of US is vaccine only, 1% here and there. We should talk about world percentage. How many people on our planet have been vaccinated? And I'll simply stop with what you started with, Andy, this sort of vaccine diplomacy. Unfortunately, it's been misused, not for the right purpose. We should all work for increasing the vaccination of the last African, because we won't be able to travel and etc. I won't talk about the vaccine passport, but I would just like to emphasize that in my view, it's not a theoretical problem. It's a production necessity, and we have to find ways and forget about the WTO rules and all this, but produce. Thank you.
That's a great provocation, and also that idea of, you know, we should all be working for the last African to get vaccinated. It seems again so rational and logical. as we look for a way forward.
I think it's biology.
Oh, it is biology, right?
It's biology.
It is. Maybe back to Michaela a little bit, and then Tedros, in terms of the way forward. So your working paper outlines some solutions. The folks at Gavi and COVAX have ideas. Gabrielle, that innovation you described in the private sector feels very valuable. Thinking about refrigeration or deep freezing in Africa, and Coca-Cola coming in, and distributors coming in. Some of that happened in the United States too. Early on, there was lots of get the government out of the way. I remember some guy in Texas, I think, a Republican, had a factory that could turn out a lot of masks, and he was yelling at a hearing, congressional hearing, we're ready to do this, and the rules and government was in the way. That feels promising to me, but it also leads to other questions. So Michaela, who has to read your paper, and then how would this translate into action? And then Tedros, and then back to Sonia.
It seems to me that Gabrielle doesn't have to read the paper, because I agreed 100% with everything she said, and I actually love the way she phrased it. But let me tell you, so essentially in a few words, what the arguments that we are trying to make in the paper. The first point is that the situation on vaccine is somehow worse than what we have experienced during the first wave of the pandemic with the masks and the other medical goods. And this is essentially for two reasons. The first, I already alluded to, is the fact that we have essentially a vaccines producers club. There are 13 countries, considering the European Union as a single country, that are producing these vaccines, and they rely on each other for the production of the ingredients, particularly the key ingredients that are needed for the vaccine. So for key ingredients, around 90% are sourced from other vaccine producers. So what this implies is that because these countries are interdependent, they are not very likely to hurt each other with measures such as export restrictions, but they are more likely to restrict these exports for all the others, which are the large majority of countries, and obviously all the least developed countries. So that's the first set of concerns. The second have to do with the production side. The goal, as Gabrielle said it very clear, is to increase production, but we face several challenges relative to the increased production of masks that we did a few months ago. The first is that these are much more complex goods, so that it's difficult to expand production rapidly in these products. And as Gabrielle said, it may not be a problem of intellectual property rights protection. The second issue is that expanding investment capacity is risky, and so the market naturally will underprovide that. And so that's the second concern. The third, on the production side, is that very often it's difficult to match the firms that have the know-how and the firms that have the capacity to boost production, that have some slack resources that they can use. Keep in mind that in normal times, these are all firms that compete with each other. That's what we want them to do. We want them to compete. Right. But here somehow we want some form of very fast collusion in order to boost production. So these are the problems. And if we don't do anything about it, we are just going to see more vaccine nationalism. So what we can do in the paper that is together with Samuel Evenet, Bernard Oakman, and Nadia Rocha, we are making 4 proposals. It'll be very fast and elaborate later. The first is try to avoid export restrictions and keep up and enhance the monitoring of these measures. The second proposal is to improve the transparency and our understanding of the vaccine value chain. Very often, governments act because they have fear, and the fear is fueled by ignorance, the lack of information. And so if we don't know exactly how much production we will have tomorrow, we're more likely to restrict today. That's probably one reason why governments are reluctant, even if they have a lot of supplies of a certain vaccine, to let it go. The third, we need to support investment in capacity. We need subsidies and other measures that will offset the risks that investors face in that domain. And then fourth, and that's similar to what Gabrielle was alluding before, we need a sort of clearinghouse. We need a mechanism to bring together the firms that have the know-how, the firms that lack capacity can boost production, and allow them to match, because there is always a surge cost which makes it difficult for these companies to meet, especially because they are not used to do that. So these four actions go beyond the trade policy, but they will be very important because if we expand production, we will reduce the incentive to resort to vaccine nationalism.
That's excellent. Again, I hope this message gets out there. And Tedros said, focusing on the law, knowing the economic potential, what feels like a next step here? What can CCSI, Columbia, the law school, just the international community be thinking about and doing differently?
I was going to say the fifth item in Michele's list, which will be closely linked to the third, if we want to be realist, because I don't think that it makes any sense to speak about changing the culture. These things won't happen tomorrow. But one simple thing that can help your third point, Michele, is this. A few years ago, we went through SARS, which is not, didn't become a pandemic like COVID, but it was quite important. And now one thing we realized through the SARS experience, actually two things we realized. First is, once again, health policies were national health policies with a strong nationalistic bias. People were not sharing medicine around the world, and few had the capacity, the second point, to produce this medicine. So how do I address now, what is the optimal response when I'm facing an export restriction by the producer? I think the optimal response is subsidization. Some things I can produce myself, like masks, anybody can. Some things I cannot, like the vaccine. Now, the fact of the matter is, and this is one thing I never understood about the WTO, is if you subsidize your mask-producing industry or your pharmaceutical, you risk facing countervailing duty on the other side, because there are no benign subsidies anymore in the WTO since 2000. I mean, you open the first Economics 101 book and you see about subsidies sometimes being the first best instrument. In the WTO, all subsidies are bad. So I was expecting the WTO, especially after SARS and a bit later, the financial crisis of 2008, to rethink its regime of subsidy. Nothing happened. Now, everybody has adopted a pragmatic approach, and nobody took this up, because subsidies did happen, nobody took them to challenge the legality with WTO. But the fact of the matter is, in the eyes of the WTO 2021, a subsidy to produce masks and a subsidy to help vaccines, production of, or increase production of vaccines, is not a subsidy that the traders will definitely accept. They can challenge it. I will let Sanya speak about compulsory licensing, which is the other, because subsidy can help, for example, let's say a mid-level developed country which is close to producing the vaccine. It will not help somebody who lags behind, but the one who lags behind can still produce masks, and still, if you play by the WTO book, cannot, because risk countervailing duties.
This brings to mind, I just noticed there's a piece that has been published I'll just show it here. Add to stream. Whoops. Hold on. Sonia, if you had a thought in the meantime, I'm going to show something that Ashish Jha just wrote in Foreign Affairs that's very relevant. But
Sure. Just following on from what the other speakers have been saying, yes, there have been some important partnerships in dealing with COVID, including private sector partnerships or public-private partnerships. And some of these were voluntary licenses. So we know, for example, that the Serum Institute in India is producing COVID vaccines under a voluntary license. But we've been having, these voluntary licenses have been occurring since the start of the pandemic. And as you can see, we still have insufficient vaccine supply. And in fact, Pfizer told Reuters yesterday that they are not doing any more voluntary licenses for COVID vaccines until the pandemic phase is over. And only when they get to the phase of regular supplies, I guess because I think this will be endemic and you have to keep getting a booster shot every so on, but then they will look at additional licensing opportunities. So there are companies who have the capacity to switch to making COVID vaccines, but they're not voluntary licenses from the patent owners or the developers of the original vaccines. These voluntary licenses are limited, exclusive, often non-transparent, and this is insufficient to address the needs of the current pandemic. So as has been raised, of course, it's good that we also have the COVAX facility this time around, but according to a number of governments, COVAX is insufficient because at best it provides very short-term, limited access to vaccines. The approach is not sustainable in the medium and long term given the massive global needs. And as the World Health Organization's Director General noted a few weeks ago, rich countries have bought up the majority of the supply of multiple vaccines at the expense of COVAX. So COVAX is sitting there, but they don't have the supply of vaccines because rich countries have bought them up from the limited production capacity given the existing voluntary licenses that companies like Pfizer have been willing to sign. So we even see countries like Canada taking 1.9 million doses of vaccines from COVAX, even though it has ordered enough vaccines to cover its population more than 3 times. So this is why more than 100 countries at the WTO are saying, look, business as usual since the start of the pandemic with these kinds of voluntary licenses have not been enough. And yes, although compulsory licenses are possible under TRIPS, they are product by product, country by country, and it's not clear that you would have these kinds of, and we know, for example, exporting the majority of your production under a voluntary license, it's only happened once from Canada and then never again because it was so difficult to do, as Doctors Without Borders said. So it's also not clear that some types of intellectual property protection even allow compulsory licenses under the intellectual property rules in the WTO. For example, can you do a compulsory license for the trade secrets that are so important in the production, for example, of COVID vaccines? So this is why more than 100 countries are saying in the WTO that we need to have a waiver of these certain types of intellectual property protection for COVID products temporarily during this pandemic to just unlock that extra production capacity because voluntary licenses are not doing it. And there are companies who are willing to produce but are not being given these voluntary licenses because Pfizer has said they're not doing any more voluntary licenses. So business as usual has not produced enough vaccines or masks or other products that are needed, including test kits. And so something else has to be done. And so while the rich countries, by sometime this year will have vaccinated all of their citizens and will be able to reopen their economies, developing countries at this rate, and least developed countries will not be able to for another 5 years, as Bloomberg has said. So in the meantime, the European Union, of course, imposed this export restriction system, which Italy used to block the export of some COVID vaccines to Australia. So, I mean, one way of thinking about it is if the rich countries are going to keep buying up the vaccines and they're not going to solve the problem, then at least get out of the way of countries who are trying to solve it by waiving the TRIPS intellectual property rules at the WTO to unlock additional supply capacity to end this pandemic. Because as the WHO has said, nobody's safe till everybody's safe, because while it's still circulating in developing countries, the mutations can come back to the developed countries and then they'll have to revaccinate again with new strains of vaccine, and booster shots and so on. And the economic impacts, as we heard, impact even the developed countries if the developing countries are not vaccinated.
So I'm going to play a little game here. There's a meeting at the White House today. The Washington Post reported this morning. Well, it's a meeting, by phone or the like, with Biden administration, Australia, India, and Japan. Some of this is in the context of China's vaccine adventurism, I guess you'd call it. But if you were in the room, maybe we'll start with Gabrielle. You're not in your role at the WTO. If you're just given your expertise, if you were in the room, what would you be whispering to people to?
I think I would be whispering that this is good. And I think our DG said it to the UK last week. It's not only the surplus that should go to developing countries. We have to do both. Vaccine our people and send vaccine doses abroad. It has to be done on all fronts. And again, I don't want to repeat that, but even if there was a waiver, if we have only 3 billion production capacity, the waiver will not in 2 weeks give us 10 that we need. And this is why I'm impressed. Even in the US, I think a couple of last week or weeks, where there was this deal between Merck, Johnson & Johnson, and Biden, where Merck has not yet invented anything but agreed to produce. In antitrust rules, this deal, I don't know, could possibly be challenged, but this is 2 companies with the government, and the focus is forget the rules, forget this, just produce the damn thing. We'll talk further after. And again, I don't want to take position on this waiver. I just want to say that what is needed is innovation, not necessarily in amending the rules, possibly, although subsidies rules as a reference in Article 7 to natural disaster, force majeure, all these provisions that could be invoked for a government to possibly treat rules on subsidies differently. But I think that today the problem is not about rules, it's about action. Speed action. And I fully agree with what President Biden said again in this clipping that he put until the last, and I think it comes from the WHO DG, until the last person is vaccinated or protected, every single American is potentially under threat. And this is true for everyone. So I don't think it's an issue of do we produce just for us or just for abroad. I think it's everything on all fronts. That's why collaboration is a must.
That's a great insight. And I would imagine there's not a lot of debate about that here in this panel. But Tedros, if you were in the White House or on that phone call, what would be the message you'd be sending to?
My message would be enlarge the group. Don't keep it between Australia, India, and Japan. Take all those guys who can produce vaccines to be part of the deal and agree on targets. Who sells how much where? Because I don't think that the world will have what Hedley Bull called 50 years ago international community from one day to the other. These things don't happen overnight. But to the extent that a number of leading nations are prepared to accept reciprocal costs to advance what the goals of the international community, I think Biden can be the leader of a concerted effort, but with more players around him, not just this four.
And Mikkel, I guess I'm going to ask each of you the same question. So that idea of expanding that group, that actually meshes, I think, with your work on the vaccine club, some of the solutions there.
Absolutely. I agree with what Tedros just said. If I were in the room and I could whisper something, I would probably say, don't focus too much on diplomacy, in the sense that, in the true meaning of diplomacy, diplomacy is just using in a strategic way vaccines or ingredients or know-how to pursue some foreign policy or geopolitical goal. This should not be the objective, because if you take that route, you're, by nature of foreign policy, you're going to be selective, which is just another way of saying that you will apply discrimination. And this is should not be the objective, because as we said, at this point in time, each of us, the problem is to expand efficiency and to expand production globally.
And sorry, Sonia, back to you for one more reflection. and then we're heading toward the close here. This has been a very valuable initial discussion here through the Columbia Center for Unsustainable Investment of how we fully vaccinate the planet, let the rules flex where they need to, and let innovation flourish at least. So what's your kind of takeaway and your message going forward?
So, I mean, of course, it's great for developed countries to give their surplus vaccine to developing countries and least developed countries, but that's not enough, because the US university study found that would still cause double the deaths than if they were distributed equitably. You know, everybody does the healthcare workers first, but everybody does the vulnerable and so on. And if that's the system going forward, that means if there are mutations in the virus and then you need a new vaccine or a booster shot, again, do the developed countries vaccinate everybody in the developing countries, and LDCs wait with that mutation circulating around their communities until the developed countries have vaccinated everybody, and then only they get the leftovers? Because that's what that system entrenches. So, I mean, as Gabriella Marceau was saying, we need more production, and one way to do that is through waiving the intellectual property rules in the WTO, because that will unlock new production capacity, because there are companies who have said we have the capacity to do it, but we don't have the access to it because Pfizer and so on won't sign voluntary licenses with us. So we do need to increase the supply, we do need to increase the production, and one way of doing that is through the COVID TRIPS waiver, and whether that means you convert existing vaccine factories or build new ones. You might take a few out the TRIPS waiver, which is being blocked by these developed countries, while they hoard the vaccines for themselves and do vaccine nationalism in ways that not just harm and result in the deaths of people in developing countries and least developed countries, but harm their own economies, as Beyond City pointed out. Half of the $9.2 trillion in economic loss this year from vaccine nationalism will fall on developed countries, because developing countries cannot unlock their economies and so on.
Hold on one more second here. I just want to close out with one last image, and that is not it. That's a map of the general impediments to medical gear getting where it needs to go. But here, sorry, we'll close out with this. These are two visions of the power of getting vaccines where they're needed. I think we didn't actually get to that point of the even getting vaccines to the healthcare workers and frontline workers around the world as a priority. Seems utterly doable, with at least as an interim step toward full efficacy, full vaccination. And maybe if anyone has been thinking about that too, if we had targeted at least that, which is what COVAX theoretically is about. Is there some step that could be taken promptly that gets that level out there? And Gabriella or Mikhail, I don't know if that's relevant before we close out.
I think it's yes. I mean, vaccinating nurses. Am I speaking or Sanya is?
I had asked Gabrielle. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a choice. Not all countries decided to vaccine first, help people. Some focus on older people. All sorts of interesting sort of social choices. And also now that, you hear this still from younger people. Why do we all have to lock in for older people? Maybe 60 years ago, when people went to war, the value of old people was different. Well, this is a philosophical sort of debate. It is possible. And I think I have nothing to add other than, yes, we need to expand the group. Of course, we need coordination. And there, the UN system, which is not sufficient but useful, as forums for countries to discuss, and more transparency. I think transparency is fundamental, not only to know what to do where, but also to collectively produce. There is no other answer to the problem, no other answer than collaboration and coordination and help. And I keep repeating, it's a production issue. We should go for it together.
with the motivation, both rational and ethical, that the global scale is the pathway. It sounds like, even if you're just
It's
taking
a
a practical
question of-
economic.
It's for me, it's just a question of survival. It's not the ice or the dinosaur. We need to do it for our individual interest, for our group interest, country, and the planet. We need it.
That's a pretty good place maybe to conclude. I hope you've all taken away something today from this discussion. Perhaps we can reconvene in a month or two to see what progress can be made or has been made. Thank you all for being here today. Tedros Mavridis at Columbia, Sonia Smith at Third World Network, Gabriella Marceau, World Trade Organization, and Mikhail Ruta with the World Bank Group, and the folks who helped to pull this together from the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. Sustainable implicitly includes equitable, and there's much to be done. I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute. This is a Sustain What webcast. It's part of the Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. For those watching, this gets archived right away. You look at the little scrolling bar at the bottom. There are ways to get in touch with me with feedback or to learn how to share this and to support us as well. Thank you all for being here. Stay safe, get vaccinated fully as soon as you can, and make sure that people around you are safe as well. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much.